Okay, students, so by now hopefully you've watched the short video clip on the alarm calling behavior in these Belding's ground squirrels. What's interesting to know about the behavior is that these ground squirrels that are calling, that are making these loud noises when they see a big predator coming, like that cat, that bobcat that's chasing them, or the big hawk in the air, is that they're actually drawing attention to themselves. And so what happens is that the probability of being killed by a predator is a lot higher if you're actually yelling when you see a predator. Predator's coming and you yell really loud, ah, well, that draws attention to yourself. But it helps others because you'll notice that the other ones all run into their burrows really, really quickly. And so we end up looking at this behavior that we call altruism. And altruism is acting selfless, right? We might think about like Mother Teresa or someone who's acting for the good of others instead of the self. And what we're asking as behavioral biologists is whether or not this truly selfless behavior is really what it seems to be, because what it looks like is it's an example of group selection that we were talking about before, that it's acting for the good of the species. And we put a question mark here because we know that because of all the things that we talked about in class, that group selection can't really operate, right? That selection acts at the level of the what? At the individual, not at the group. And so can altruism, where you're really helping others, can it evolve? If you call really loud and you attract a predator and it kills you, how are your genes going to get passed on to the next generation? And that's the question about altruistic behavior that we want to be looking at right now. So if we're thinking about this concept of altruism, then what we have to ask whenever we're asking about how does a particular behavior, or how has a particular behavior come about, is that we're asking how has the behavior evolved. And so when we ask that question, we have to ask how has the behavior evolved to benefit the individual. Okay, so in this example of these ground squirrels calling, we say, well, it doesn't seem to be benefiting that individual because they're more likely to get killed by the predator. It's benefiting the others. And what happens is we have to think about, how does evolution operate? Well, remember that the idea of natural selection and evolution passing on genes is that you're going to get more of your genes into the next generation than others, relative to others. Remember the idea of fitness? You produce more offspring relative to others in the population. And you say, well, how is this squirrel that's calling getting more of his or her genes into the next generation by calling? And the answer is that if you share genes with relatives, shared genes, that as long as you do something to benefit a relative and you share genes with that relative, then you're getting more copies of your own genes into future generations. Okay, does that make sense? So that when you have offspring, you're sharing genes with your with your offspring, with your children, right? So you're getting your genes into the next generation by the production of offspring. But what's really interesting is that we have this other concept of shared genes with non-offspring relatives. So that if you help out a cousin, or you help out a sister, or you help out a niece or a nephew or a grandparent or a grandchild, that because you share genes with those individuals and they go on to live, to survive and reproduce, you're passing along copies of your genes because of the fact that you help those relatives that you share genes with. So this has really interesting consequences for evolution, doesn't it? We usually think pretty simplistically about surviving and reproducing your own offspring, but in fact, the idea that helping relatives can help your genes evolve makes us look at behavior in a lot of different kinds of ways. So one of the first things that you might guess is that who would you be most likely to help? You know, who are the individuals that you're going to be more likely to exhibit this sort of helpful behavior towards? And that gets back to the idea of who are you more closely related to, right? So do you think that you would help a second cousin twice removed as much as you might help your sister or brother? Okay, and intuitively you think, well, that's sister or brother, and that's because they're more closely related to you. And so what we can do is we can actually calculate a coefficient of relatedness called little r, and little r is just the probability that any two individuals will share a copy of a particular gene. Okay, and so in a diploid species like humans are, and that just means that we reproduce sexually, okay, and that you have eggs and sperm involved, and that what happens is that you get half your genetic material from your mother, and you get half your genetic material from your father, and so does a sibling, right? So each allele, which is really the same thing as a gene, there's copies of genes, has a 50% chance of segregating either into an egg or a sperm during what we call meiosis. Okay, and if you don't fully understand that, all you have to realize is that you're 50% related to your siblings, meaning that you have 50% of their genetic material in common on average. Now this little chart shows the degree of genetic relatedness to yourself that you might have to others. So if we start at looking at the self here, you're 100% related to yourself, meaning 100% genes in common with yourself. It's kind of a silly thing, but so what happens if you have a mate and you produce a daughter or a son, again, they're 50% related, or an R equals 0.5. And so then a grandchild is going to get half that genetic material, so that relative to you, your grandchild has an R of 0.25, or they have 25% of genes in common with you. Okay? And the same thing's going to be true in the other direction. You share half with the father and mother. Okay, so you've got 0.5 relatedness to a parent, 0.25 related to a grandparent. Okay, and then as you start to get out here, you can look at what the relationship would be with a half-sib. If you have a brother or a sister who has a different father, for example, then you're 25% related to them, just like you are with an aunt or an uncle, and then your first cousin is going to be 0.125. So just like these terms that we're using here for humans, we can look at these relationships in ground squirrels and say, who are the ground squirrels helping? And when you look at the data, what's really interesting is that as long as there are close relatives nearby, those ground squirrels will give the alarm call. Okay, and you can test the degree of relatedness between squirrels close enough in proximity to hear the call and those that are too far away, and you'll see that the closest relatives are the one that benefit from the calling behavior. So this brings up the concept of what we call kin selection, helping out your kin. Okay, so the behavior may lower your own individual fitness, right, meaning that you don't produce your own offspring, but it enhances the reproductive success of a relative. And again, it operates because you have shared genes with that relative, so you're helping to get your own genes into future generations through helping relatives that share your genes. And then this also brings up this term, what we call inclusive fitness. Okay, so inclusive fitness includes both the fitness that you gain by having your own offspring, okay, as well as the fitness that you gain from passing on genes through your relatives. So it may be that you help cousins and aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters, but you also produce your own offspring for some organisms, for some individuals, okay? So your inclusive fitness is both the fitness that we think of normally, the number of offspring that you produce relative to others, but also the copies of genes that get passed on through your non-offspring relatives.